Let me begin by thanking all of you for your time today, for joining us on this webinar. I think you're going to find it very interesting and frankly very important. But before we get into sort of the background on the program and what's going on, let me sort of just frame the whole issue. And to begin with, I'm Steve Ashkin. I'm president of the Ashkin Group and executive director of the Green Cleaning Network. And I also want to extend my thanks to my friends and colleagues at the Healthy Schools campaign, Alexandra Mays and Mark Bishop, for helping to host and promote this program, as well as to the folks from Practice Green Health. We thank all of you for trying to invite your communities to listen into this information. And again, I want to thank each and every one of you for being on the call today. I know that everyone is very busy, but I want to do absolutely our best to make this time as valuable for you as possible. And the reason that this issue is so important and the reason that we wanted to do this webinar today is, unlike many sectors, whether we talk about food or we talk about clothing, whether we talk about toys, the cleaning industry perhaps has led all industry sectors in its adoption of third-party standards and Ecolabels. In the cleaning chemical sector alone, there are hundreds, literally hundreds of manufacturers who have adopted these programs. And as our industry has matured and as our understanding of these issues have matured, as our customers, our distributors, our service providers, our purchasers, whether they're in schools or healthcare facilities or retail, office buildings, our whole system of green cleaning is built around the use of these standards and Ecolabels. So it's very important for you to listen in today to really understand what EPA is trying to do. And at the end, hopefully, you will provide comments to EPA to make sure that they understand from our experience how we can move forward with this issue. So again, I am very delighted that you're listening in. I think you'll find the information very valuable. But before we get started, I want to talk about a few logistical issues. Next slide, please. So real quickly, our webinar will run for approximately an hour. Alison's presentation will be probably half of that, if not less. She has intentionally tried to make plenty of time set aside to get your input. We will also, as you see, be recording the webinar, and everyone who registered, the folks from Healthy Schools campaign will actually send you a note with the link attached to make it easy for you to be able to listen to the presentation or to share it with your friends and colleagues. So we'll make sure we get that out to you at the end. Next slide, please. But perhaps the most important thing that I want everyone to really think about is at the bottom right-hand side of the screen, you'll see a place where you can type your message here. So at any time during Alison's discussion, please enter your questions. And at the end, we will do absolutely our best to cover as many questions as absolutely possible. But this really is the opportunity for you to present the questions that you have and to really make this time as valuable as possible. Next slide, please. So let me jump right into it and introduce our speaker. I am very pleased to have Alison Kinn Bennett to be able to provide this introduction and this discussion for us today. She is with U.S. EPA's Office of Chemical Safety and Pollution Prevention, and she serves as the Senior Advisor for Sustainable Products and Purchasing. She founded and co-leads two influential networks within EPA, and those are the Green Building Work Group and the Sustainable Products and Purchasing Network. And these groups bring together policy and technical staff to advance a holistic, life cycle-based approaches to environmental and human health protection. Since 2001, Alison has served in EPA's Environmentally Preferable Purchasing Program and has focused her efforts on voluntary consensus standards and specifications for greener building products and construction services. Alison is currently leading EPA's effort to propose an approach and a set of guidelines for assessing product environmental performance standards and ecolabels for federal procurement. Alison is also representing EPA on the advisory committees of the Sustainable Purchasing Leadership Council, the Responsible Purchasing Network, ISEAL's Claims Guidance, and the United Nations Environmental Program Sustainable Public Procurement Initiative. On a personal note, I have had the pleasure of working with Alison's office since 1993, when the first presidential executive order was written that sort of began the whole effort on environmentally preferable purchasing. I want to say in front of everyone on the phone, Alison, how much we appreciate the work that your office has done, and thank you for your time today. And with that, allow me to turn the presentation over to you.
Thank you very much for that very generous introduction and for having me today, and to all the organizers for reaching out and allowing me to have this opportunity to answer questions just about what is EPA doing here. It is complicated for those of us even that have been working in this space for a very long time, and so conversations are always very helpful. And I was joking a little bit. I see some of you have already tuned in to one of my webinars over the past couple months, and many new faces and names as well. Hopefully this will provide new insights for those that have already listened in, and you will be keeping me honest and consistent in this presentation. So, bottom line, before I walk through the slides and the background and all the nitty-gritty fun stuff with this effort, I just want to kind of set the context with what is EPA proposing here, what is the bottom line. So we are really, in this Federal Register notice and with this effort in these guidelines, testing a concept which we think provides a fair, consistent approach to assessing private sector standards and ecolabels that would result in a list of standards and ecolabels for federal purchasers to use in meeting our many green purchasing mandates. So that's it. Lots of questions about that I hope to answer today. Trying to forward here. Give me a moment. It's not forwarding, Alex, so I'll be patient. There you go. Thank you. So some background here and context so you know the perspective that EPA is coming from and the primary authorities and intentions by which we're issuing these guidelines for comment. Our program grows out of many greening of government executive orders, as Steve said, going back to the early 90s, most recently Executive Order 13514, which requires 95% of new public procurement actions to include green attributes, and it goes off to tick a number of attributes: energy efficiency, water efficiency, recycled content, and where my program fits in, this concept of environmentally preferable products and services. And we've been trying to define just what that means ever since. We take a multi-attribute, life cycle-based approach to defining environmentally preferable purchasing. There we go. And it's complicated and fun work, as you all probably know well. It depends upon the product category or the service category you're talking about in defining what makes a purchase environmentally preferable. And our program sits within EPA's Toxics Office, the Office of Chemical Safety and Pollution Prevention, but we have the benefit of working across the agency, pulling from expertise within all of EPA's program offices to help us in this task of defining environmentally preferable. The role of standards. This is a key strategic focus of EPA's environmentally preferable purchasing program for a variety of reasons. First, after listening to many stakeholders over the 20 or so years of our program, actually October 20th is our 21st birthday, and you'll all be getting an invitation to the party. Manufacturers want one clear definition of green or environmentally preferable. You could add sustainable, etc., so that they can design and build products that meet it and reduce the disparate demands from purchasers. Purchasers want a single robust list of products verified to meet strong, credible environmental performance criteria that helps them reduce their environmental impacts. And so not long ago, or actually quite long ago, the federal government recognized that standards were key to meeting these needs. But more broadly, along the same time that the EPP program was born, Congress issued the National Technology Transfer and Advancement Act, and it encouraged federal agencies to not only participate in the development of voluntary consensus standards, but also directed us to use them in our procurement. And we are very actively engaged in a number of different standards development activities. Here are just a sampling of those standards activities that the EPP program has engaged in, pulling EPA expertise in to help define what is environmentally preferable in these particular product categories. So you see we've done work in electronics, buildings and furnishings, meetings and hospitality, among others. And this is working with organizations that bring in multiple stakeholders from multiple perspectives and a variety of expertises to help define that tough question of, over the life cycle, what is environmentally preferable. Despite clarity in these standards areas, potentially for purchasers and manufacturers, there is still confusion, as we know. Thus, enter the guidelines. So here, come back and tune in if you'd been tuned out because you already are familiar with the EPP program. I'll be getting into the meat of the issues here. The guidelines were developed, as I mentioned, we've been listening for a long time to federal purchasers, manufacturers, environmental organizations, and on this issue of providing clarity around environmentally preferable and the role of standards in doing so, private sector standards in doing so. EPA partnered with GSA and many other federal agencies. Surprisingly, we really need all of these federal agencies to help us manage this issue. They each have not only technical expertise, but policy expertise and procurement expertise that is critical to the federal government's response in this space. We've held a number of listening sessions over the 2-3 year period that we were developing these. Many of you hopefully were able to provide input during that time as well. So where do we end up? Again, we're hoping that these guidelines and our potential approach that we're proposing provides a transparent, fair, and consistent approach to selecting non-governmental, private sector product environmental performance standards and ecolabels for voluntary use in federal procurement. But a not-so-secret goal and hope is that this provides clarity to broader marketplace institutional purchasers. You'll see as we go through some of the guidelines, we're largely basing this on recognized protocols for standards development, conformity assessment, and ecolabel program management, consistent with U.S. government standards policy. That's that National Technology Transfer and Advancement Act and OMB Circular A119. If you want to get really geeky with us here in the EPP program, you can read those too. We released the Federal Register notice informally November 20th, then it was published November 27th. We are in the process of formally extending the comment period to April 25th to give you a couple more months. And we've heard from a number of stakeholders that we're just diving into this after the holidays, that is welcome news. We're excited to hear that many stakeholders are collaborating in their responses, and I hope this conversation can lead to some of that as well. So what are these things? So we have 4 sections, as I mentioned, largely based on already recognized protocols consistent with U.S. government standards policies, certainly with room for interpretation, though. The first section is guidelines for the process for developing standards. Here, there shouldn't be any surprise. We're interested in transparency, the balance of stakeholders, and appeals process, for example. Section 2 of the guidelines, we think, offers some new areas for discussion and is where EPA's expertise lies and where we are, I think, contributing the most to the dialogue on what makes for a more robust, credible standard or eco-label. The guidelines for environmental effectiveness of the standards. And here we are looking for criteria that support the claim of environmental preferability, the measurability. Does it support significant differentiation in the marketplace? Is there life cycle approaches, focus on hot spots, hazard-based approach, impact and ingredient disclosure? These are all things that we're hoping to send a signal to the marketplace that the federal government is interested in standards and eco-labels, incentivizing and encouraging, if not requiring. The third section and the fourth section. Let me, before I go into these, just state that there's lots of variety in how standards and certification systems in the marketplace work. And similarly, there's many different needs depending upon the product category, depending upon the environmental attributes and the risks of a product not meeting the criteria that would come into play in determining if these are applicable sections to consider. The guidelines for conformity assessment, I want to be clear, we aren't suggesting across the board that third-party certification is going to be required. Like many other issues, it's a product category by product category discussion that needs to happen, even maybe an environmental attribute by attribute discussion that should happen, depending upon the risk of nonconformance, for example. Similarly, the guidelines for management of eco-labeling programs, there are many instances where there is a standard in the marketplace that for a variety of reasons may not be associated with an eco-label or multiple eco-labels, I guess you could say. And we are not suggesting that all standards have to be associated with an eco-label. And so these guidelines would come into play in differing ways depending upon the particular procurement decision and or broad decision on a product category basis that these guidelines may lead to. So again, transparency, independence, disclosure, dispute resolution are themes in these two sections. The Federal Register notice is really important for you to read before you jump into the guidelines. You'll be very confused, I think, if you just read the guidelines about what we're asking. So we're seeking comment on not only the technical nature of the guidelines, but I think even more importantly, the market-based process for assessing standards and eco-labels. I'll get more into that in a bit, and I hope and I expect some of our questions and answer session to be focused on that. I'll say that we recognize emerging market capacity for assessing standards and eco-labels, and we do not necessarily think, keep in mind this is a small program with small budget, and this is an area that requires lots of multi-stakeholder input. So we aren't suggesting that EPA needs to be in the driver's seat or that the federal government necessarily needs to be in the driver's seat. There could be a market-based approach to this whereby allowing the federal government and EPA to be a participant in an external process. If the market doesn't respond in a timely manner and or needs a little boost to get this discussion going and implementation going, we are considering a pilot, and we would seek feedback on which product categories to begin assessing in such a pilot. So these are the questions that we've raised. In the Federal Register notice, we will hold the slide here to tee up discussion, but by no means have this limit your questions to me and or your input in the Federal Register notice. Let me run through these to tease out a couple more issues I didn't cover. Clearly, despite all the homework we did, there are very likely gaps, and we know you will tell us about them. The designations of baseline and leadership. This is one of those things that you have to read the Federal Register notice or you won't know what the little b and little l mean next to each of our guidelines. We did an initial feasibility study and testing of an early draft of the guidelines with both government labels and private sector labels, and many of which you're familiar with, but we were limited to talking to 9 external organizations because of our Paperwork Reduction Act. That said, we learned a lot, and the guidelines evolved. The baseline determinations were largely informed by that study, and we learned where there was opportunities to, across sectors, allow for there to be a baseline consideration or prerequisites where we think that many standards and eco-labels could meet those baseline guidelines. The leadership guidelines, on the other hand, depending upon maturity of standards and eco-labels in particular product categories, are potentially not achievable today by all standards and eco-labels, nor may they necessarily be appropriate in all cases, depending upon the environmental considerations in a particular product category or the stakeholder interests. So the leadership are sending a signal as to good practice that we like to see more of, that potentially wouldn't be applied the same across sectors. The third question here tees up just this recognition that there are many potential approaches, many scenarios of how this could be played out in implementation. Each of the guidelines presents unique challenges in determining conformance, and we'd love input on how that may look and how, growing from our very brief description of a potential market-based approach, how might you add some meat to the bones of that concept. I mentioned that EPA is considering a pilot project. How might that look to you all? How might you want to engage in that? What role would you like to play? Those are all aspects of this question we're teeing up, and we'd love to know from you. Certainly, which product category should be prioritized, not only based on environmental impact and volume of spend, but where is there more confusion? Which product categories have more competing standards and eco-labels? Other variables there in determining which product category should be prioritized. Finally, a catch-all. Our intention, again, is a transparent, fair, and consistent process. Are we getting close with what we've proposed? How might you suggest we address, resolve any challenges in getting to implementation? So I'm including my contact information for any of you that during this question and answer period don't get all of your questions answered, if you feel to reach out to me directly. And I'm ready to open it up to questions and answers. I'll go back to the previous list of questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Alison. This is Alex Mays from Healthy Schools Campaign, and I am going to be running our question and answer session. So thank you, Alison, for that very informative presentation, and we look forward to hearing the participants' questions. So please, as Steve mentioned, you can chat in your questions using the questions box on the bottom right-hand side of your screen. And you can type those in and send them to us, and we will be sure to get to them. So first question for Alison. In the section on developing the guidelines, you mentioned hotspots. Would you explain what that means?
Sure, and I might have used it a couple of different ways. With regard to the specific guidelines for environmental effectiveness of the criteria within a standard or an eco-label, we want to make sure that a product environmental performance standard is looking at the right issues. For example, recycled content may not be the hot spot for a light bulb. So that's the first question, and you determine that based upon some life cycle thinking and methodologies. So that's something that we would be wanting to align our purchasing around standards and eco-labels that look at the right hot spot. More broadly, in terms of institutional spend, the term hotspot is looking at, based upon sort of either input-output life cycle assessment or some other methodologies and considerations, what product categories are the hotspots in federal spend. And we are doing some work with GSA on that as well. and trying to understand where there are the biggest opportunities for environmental improvement if we target our sustainable acquisition efforts towards those particular hotspot sectors or product categories. So that's how we're using the term in this space.
Great, thank you so much. And the next question is from somebody who works in a school wanting to know how these guidelines are going to affect them, or if they will.
Well, hopefully you can eventually turn to a list of standards and eco-labels that the federal government is using that has been developed by experts and stakeholders in the field, and you'll have some trust behind the standards and eco-labels, and it'll hopefully help separate the wheat from the chaff, and so you don't have to be assessing the standards and eco-labels yourselves.
Great, thank you. Has the EPA prepared a standard document form or template for collecting input? Maybe you could just speak a little bit about how people provide input on the guidelines.
Sure. We have opened a docket, regulations.gov. All of these instructions are in the Federal Register notice that you can get to via the website I showed here. I'm trying to forward to it. It's epa.gov/EPP/draft guidelines. And the docket will, the nice functionality there is everyone can see everyone else's comments. And it's a website tool that is, as the name indicates, intended to hold comments on rules and regulations, but the federal government uses it for voluntary initiatives like this as well.
Hey, Allison, can you hear me?
Yes.
Allison, I'm sorry, everyone. This is Steve. Would you mind, or would you have the ability just to literally show people that site? Can you do that from your computer? Or
there's a link directly to it from the site I did. I can't do that right now just because I'm not driving the webinar, and I think it might take Alex a little too long to guide.
No problem, because
yeah.
there's a lot of people who have done submitted comments to a Federal Registry notice, and they understand what you're talking about. But I just thought for others who have never done it before, it actually is quite easy. So I just wanted to make sure we were taking that barrier away from people. But if you go to the website, it's easy, sure.
I hope so. There's a big button comment here, I think, that you get to from the EPA program site. If you don't want to try to read the Federal Register notice on its own site, you can read it from our site.
And we'll be sure to include that link in the email that goes out to everybody with the recording of the webinar and a link to the slides from today, too. So next question for Allison. Is there an estimated timetable when the list of environmentally preferred eco-labels will be developed?
That is the big question. I'm the worst person to ask because I'm way too idealistic. That's the only way I've stayed sane in working in this program for this long. You know, I really do hope that we could, if it's an EPA pilot or an externally run pilot of this effort, I'm hoping by early next year we can begin to tease out and assess some high priority product category standards and eco-labels.
Great, thank you. And next question, will the guidelines also apply to federal programs such as EPA's Energy Star and DFE program and USDA's BioPreferred program?
So I knew I was going to get this question. It's the most popular. Let me answer it in a few different ways. Our intentions here are to expand federal purchasing use of private sector standards, and that is in line with the National Technology Transfer Act and many goals of the federal government. We want to allow for more innovative purchasing through use of private sector standards and eco-labels. So why not the federal labels? No, these guidelines are not intended to be used to assess those federal programs for a few different reasons. The initial testing that I mentioned, we did learn a lot from and about federal programs in assessing them against the initial draft guidelines. And we think EPA labels are aligned in intent with the guidelines, but you'll have to recognize that we have different processes, the Administrative Procedures Act, to get to those intentions of transparent openness, due process. In terms of environmental effectiveness, they also are aligned in terms of focusing on the hot spots. But this effort doesn't have this guidelines effort doesn't have the authority to undo or change existing mandates that are out there. This is intended to augment the use of private sector standards and eco-labels alongside these existing mandates.
Great, thank you. And next question, will the guidelines address disinfectants, sanitizers, and other registered pesticides?
We didn't speak to that particular product category. We aren't ruling anything out. We want to hear from you all which product category should be focused on first. So potentially, I would say.
Okay, great. The next question is, the Federal Register notice identifies emerging markets. Will you do something specific for more mature markets?
That term is actually referring to there's emerging market capacity to assess standards and eco-labels. That meaning there are organizations out there that have the expertise in standards development processes, environmental effectiveness, eco-label program management, et cetera, that could be brought in to assess standards and eco-labels in both, to use the term again, emerging sectors and more mature sectors. So we weren't referring to emerging standards and eco-labels per se when we're using that term. I hope that clarifies it.
Great, thank you. And this probably falls into the same category, but will the EPA attempt to tackle difficult issues like the controversy around forestry eco-labels?
Well, this is just me talking. I don't know if that's the first one we want to pilot test, but we do want to hear from all of you. Those standards are incorporated by reference in a number of the multi-attribute standards that the federal government is currently using in more piecemeal ways. And so if we are going to be using those standards in a more consistent across-the-board way, they may be brought into the fold. For example, if we looked at furniture as one of the first product categories.
Great, thanks. And so next question, do you anticipate this guidance affecting Type 3 product declarations in addition to the more common Type 1 eco-labels? So that's the first.
Thank you. Yes. So there is another effort that EPA has co-authored, the International PCR guidance, that you can Google and find. These don't necessarily have to be on separate tracks, but to keep things, and they were coming from different directions and just happened to be released in the same year. The International PCR guidance looks at declarations, product categories, environmental product declarations, and is very much aligned with, I think, the intent and the scope that our guidelines, which are more focused on those product environmental performance standards, not just disclosure standards, address. We have a Q&A that in the website link that deals with that one in a bit more depth. There's certainly, we're interested in your thoughts on how these efforts could merge, but purchasers use these tools in different ways, and our program is coming at this from the perspective of a purchaser, which our program thinks should rely, if available, product environmental performance standards first, rather than having to do the work of comparing a number of EPDs side by side to make a purchase decision.
Great, thank you so much. And the next question is, in your list of possible issues and items to be included in the guidelines, you mentioned hazardous materials, but nothing about exposure and risk. Is the EPA interested in addressing exposure and risk in purchasing and using building materials?
Yes, that's a major focus of our program, the Office of Chemical Safety and Pollution Prevention. I think what we wanted to demonstrate in that leadership guideline, which encourages standards and ecolabels to take a hazard-based approach, is very much aligned with our Design for the Environment programs, learnings and teachings in this space, not to take away from the important considerations regarding exposure.
Great, thank you. The next question is, does the EPA anticipate that when it makes a list of ecolabels that it will score them not only as acceptable versus unacceptable, but as levels, such as bronze, silver, or gold?
We want to hear from all of you on that. Certainly one scenario that we hint at is that these guidelines, including baseline and leadership, could be turned into a rating system where baseline becomes prerequisite and the leadership could be weighted in some way depending upon, again, the scope and the maturity of standards and ecolabels in a particular product category. So you could have product category by product category translations into rating systems of these guidelines. And that would allow for flexibility in approaches and for there to be more than one acceptable standard. So not just a pass-fail, but there could be some broader statement as to how these standards and ecolabels relate to each other. But that's something that we've been trying to hear from all of you before there's any decision made. And I'll just say, again, it's not EPA's list necessarily. We may not need to be in the driver's seat from here on out. We did our effort to get these guidelines into the conversation, and if there's a market uptake of them into a process that we can participate in and use, that would be great, but this isn't necessarily EPA's decision on how this unfolds from here.
Thank you. Next question is, my company has a number of products that are coming up for recertification, which is a lot of work and expensive for us. Should we delay recertification until after you complete your work?
Oh goodness, don't wait for us for this. I think that you might find it valuable to look through our guidelines and do your own assessment, and hopefully that provides some comfort to you that your company is going in the right direction, and share with us as you're doing that homework and assessment, share with us what you learned and what you've learned and what your concerns might be as to the program that you're investing in, and how you want to see the government continuing to purchase against that. But I really would hesitate to tell anyone to wait to continuing to do any good work in this space.
Great, thank you. If we would like to see PCR EPD effort merged with this EPP effort, is that something that we should comment on at this time?
Yes. Anything that you want to see happen is fair game for this comment period.
And another question about if something is appropriate to comment on, somebody wanting to know if food-related ecolabels are up for consideration as part of this effort.
Yeah, EPA doesn't have authority in some of that space. It's our partners in other federal agencies, USDA, FDA, for example. And I'm uncertain in how they may want to take that on as well. But I certainly would encourage all stakeholders to let us know which product categories, and if food is one that's ripe for discussion and assessment, then let us know.
Great, thank you. Next question, will the guidelines address standards developed by trade associations in addition to those developed by environmental nonprofit standard setters?
Yes, and more. Don't forget the many like that EPP program has been involved in that have been developed by third-party standards development organizations. So really, private sector is pretty broad in terms of what would be potentially game for assessment.
Great. And the next question is, how does your effort tie into work of the Sustainability Consortium, Responsible Purchasing Council, and others who are developing standards and guidelines?
Well, we hope that this effort contributes to some convergence and collaboration, and we see that happening. We know that RPN is bringing its membership together. We see the Sustainability Consortium very interested in this as well, the Sustainable Purchasing Leadership Council bringing its membership together and reaching out beyond membership to potentially collaborate on a role for implementation. We don't see any other organization as having done what these guidelines are currently doing in whole, certainly in part. ANSI has recently launched an Ecolabel accreditation that some could say is aligned with aspects of our guidelines. I think there's many opportunities for those groups to work together in responding to EPA's public comment call.
Great, thank you. And the next question is, will this program have any effect on the GSA plan for limiting the number of vendors eligible to sell to GSA?
I don't know about that. So all I would say is that EPA has worked closely with GSA. We co-led initial development of these guidelines and this effort, and they're very much looking forward to expanding their training and procurement tools to include more private sector standards and Ecolabels.
Great, thanks. The next question, you mentioned that EPA is interested in having the marketplace take up this project instead of EPA. Specifically, who might you see in the marketplace who would take on this task?
I don't want to pretend to know all the potential players EPA is engaged with, as I've mentioned, and is aware of work happening at ANSI, the Sustainability Consortium, the Sustainable Purchasing Leadership Council. There's a group called the Sustainability Standards Partnership that Resolve is engaged in. There's the Responsible Purchasing Network. There's other international efforts, the Sustainable Public Procurement Initiative of UNEP. There are lots of players, and there are also many existing certification bodies that could take on the work of, once there is that program developed, translating these guidelines into a checklist or a rating system. We want to build upon the existing infrastructure of conformity assessment in the marketplace, and so there could be a role for certification bodies in this as well, in partnership with a multi-stakeholder group. So there are lots of players, and we don't see it being necessarily limited to just one potential approach or one potential group of stakeholders in terms of the implementation.
Great, thank you so much. And we're getting down to the end of our questions, so if people have any more, please feel free to chat them in. Here's one more question. So why is the EPA proposing that standards be hazard-based instead of risk-based? In toxicology, the dose is the poison. If a chemical or product assures lower human or environmental exposure, should that not be considered?
I think it certainly is considered. I think where, for example, we've seen a challenge in green standards not necessarily having all the science to understand exposure routes. Where we have hazard information, let's use that. And maybe I'll just leave it at that. I think that's a conversation that probably is happening more intelligently in other circles than I can fully answer.
Great, thank you so much. So that actually wraps up the list of questions that we had. Thank you to everybody who was able to send them in. And if you think of any additional questions, I know Alison put her contact information up on that last slide. We'll be sending out an email with contact information as well as a link to the recording and slides. So please feel free to continue the conversation beyond this webinar and send us your thoughts and questions. And please be sure to provide comments on the guidelines. We'll be including the link to the guidelines in the email that goes out. And Steve or Alison, do you have any final thoughts that you'd like to share?
Alex, do me a favor. Would you put up Alison's contact information to make sure if anyone wants to jot that down? Yes. And from my perspective, I really want to encourage all of you in the cleaning industry, whether as a product manufacturer, a distributor, or a product purchaser, to really take a look at what's going on. I really do believe that our industry perhaps has the most to be affected by this, only because we have so well embraced the use of these eco-labels. So I really do encourage you to take a look at it and to make sure that, based on your experience, we're helping EPA and others benefit from the experience that we've had adopting and using these types of programs, so that we can encourage them to not just sort of help solve the problems of kind of the early adopters, the segments that are just figuring this out, but that we can actually take advantage of some of the expertise that EPA has to help us in our situation really keep advancing the ball and keep really driving leadership standards and leadership products and rewarding our manufacturers who are really innovating. So we want to make sure that we don't inadvertently sort of establish a bar that is really high for industries that aren't doing anything, but in the cleaning industry would actually become a barrier to additional innovation. So again, please, I encourage all of you to take the time to check this out, to think about comments. If you have questions, please feel free to contact me. I'm happy to talk to you about it. But I see this as a great opportunity for us to take the next step forward, not only for our industry, but protecting the health and safety of our product users and building occupants, as well as continuing to reduce the environmental impacts associated with the products and services that are made and used by our industry. So Alison, do you have any final comments or thoughts that you want to share with the folks on the line?
No, thank you so much for articulating that. Certainly, we don't want to stymie innovation in this space. That is the antithesis of what we're trying to do here. So thank you very much, Steve.
So with that, let me thank you, Alison, for your time. It is greatly appreciated. Alex, thank you for putting the technical stuff together. And again, for all of you that are on the line today, we will be sending you the links to the recording and the link to the Federal Registry notice. And thank you again very much for taking some time with us this afternoon. It is greatly appreciated, and have a great day.